Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Philosophical Rambler podcast. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Aidan Hart, who is known for his Orthodox iconography, as well as his monastic life and many other um, attributes that he brings to the public intellectual discussion nowadays with the likes of religion, psychology, and spirituality. So glad to have you, Aidan, on today. If you just want to familiarize yourself to the viewers.
Well, thank you for having me, Collin. I've been looking forward to it. I've enjoyed perusing your website, and I think what you're grappling with is really important. Yes, I've been a professional church artist, liturgical artist for 40 years, and before that, for about 5 years, I was a professional sculptor, Christian, but not working solely in church art. So the work I do covers a range of media, carving in stone and wood, egg-tempered panels, fresco, mosaic, and more recently, a lot of sort of consultancy. So I'm trying to look at the whole picture of the beauty of worship. So it's not just individual things, but seeing it as a symphony. I did my degree in English literature and did maths and biology as well. So I've always loved to sort of try to unite things that a lot of people have thought are opposites. So for that reason, in part, I love writing as well. So I published 3 books. And I forever seem to be giving talks and preparing talks. But I really enjoy that union of word and matter, really. So I don't see my study of an interest in science as conflicting at all with my theology. In fact, I see science as theophanic, really, studying what God has revealed through the material world. So I suppose my iconography is just a microcosm of it, understanding the whole material world as a revelation of God's wisdom and love.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I didn't even know that you had published 3 books. What are those books on?
Yeah, the first one was a rather large book. I've got it here somewhere. The Technique of Icon Painting.
There's plenty of books behind you to sift through.
So this is the first one I did, published by Catholic Publishing Company. So lots of illustrations, very technical, but on the other hand, combining the technique with the theology always. Okay. And the second one was Beauty, Spirit, Matter. So that was a collection of essays looking at different elements of our modern life through the theology of the icon. So there's a chapter on the nature of the human person, one on ecology, and one on art, not church art, but art in the world, as it were. So look at people like Brancusi and others. Then the third one was Festal Icons, which is another big book with lots of illustrations looking at the history and the meaning of the 14 major feasts of the church. One section of each chapter looks at the development of the icon. It didn't drop from heaven, it was developed. And then I'm writing a novel at the moment. That's what I'm trying to complete.
Oh, wonderful. Can you give us a hint of what that's going to be about?
Yeah, thank you. Nominally called The Temple, and it's about a secular architect, young architect, who inherits a lot of money from his uncle, on condition that he design and have built a church for a monastery, and that he meet 4 or 5 people whom he names. So initially, Luke, the architect, just wants to basically build a concrete box as cheaply as possible and take the rest of the money. The uncle didn't stipulate how much of this wealth he's got to spend on the church. But then he meets these people that he has to meet in order to receive the inheritance. And meeting them begins to change his life. And also he realizes there's profound world vision behind the history of the Orthodox architecture, and that he realizes that this church is actually like a philosophy embodied in stone and color. So tentatively it's about the building of this temple, but really it's more about his transformation. And of course, being a book, there are various crises in it and how he deals with these. So that's that various books inspired the idea.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, I hope it.
When do you anticipate for that to be out?
Well, I keep promising myself not to accept too many invitations to give talks so I can concentrate on finishing the book. No,
I understand.
I've only just got back to it after about a 4-month break. We had so many talks I had to prepare for about a week or 2 ago. So I don't know. I would hope if I have a clean sweep the next 4 months to at least finish the first draft. My publisher, Gracewing, will probably want to publish it, but I'm sort of more interested in one that's got, as it were, a deep involvement in world publishing, not just Christian publishing. It's like quite just to get out there a bit more.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
watch this space. I'm
Well,
very
I
well
appreciate
happy.
the teaser of the upcoming novel, and definitely looking forward to
Thank you.
that. We've talked in the past, obviously, about your life and how you got to the point of where you are, but viewers are probably curious how you got to the point where you are today, um, moving from being an iconographer, which obviously you still actively are, but also more into the writing and the public discourse space, if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I've always wanted to convey the beauty of life with Christ even before I became Orthodox. I was an active Anglican in a high Anglican church, so sort of Anglo-Catholic, if you like, when I was a sculptor. And I suppose it's a strong missionary element to me, not in the sense of grabbing people and telling them to convert, but I don't know, manifesting the beauty of life with Christ. Obviously, the suffering, this hardship, this struggle. I like this play in words, asceticism and aestheticism, asceticism, struggle and
That's
aestheticism.
very good.
So struggle and beauty go hand in hand. So it's always been part of me, really. And when I was in New Zealand, I started a Christian art group. So this was for any Christians involved in the arts in whatever form. So I realized that we needed a clearer vision about what we were trying to do. Yeah, what is beauty, for example? What is beauty? Is it sort of sentimental stuff or whatever? So I've been sort of grappling with these. I don't think any person can be an artist unless they're also a philosopher to some extent. The thinking of trying to get behind the apparent problems and try to get to the cause of them. So I've never really sort of not combined word and image, really. One leads to the other. And I found that images crystallize something into one central theme, and then other things sort of hang off it. Writing tends to get into the detail more. So I find if it's just the visual, one captures the essence, hopefully, but then you want to fill it out with detail. If it's only writing, you can just have lots of detail, but lose the larger plot. So I find that they go hand in hand. Of course, the best writing does paint a picture in a way, and the best picture has different layers of metaphysical depth. Yeah. And as you mentioned, I was actually a novice monk for 12 years, 3.5 years with an old Welsh monk in Wales. And then property was bought for me to be a hermit here in Shropshire. So I was sent for 2 years to Mount Athos to get more experience in a well-established monastery. And the abbot there, Father Vasilius, was an amazing man, a great writer. And what interested me about his way of relating to people and his writing and the way he gave talks was the best way I can describe it as poetic. The word poem in Greek means to make. Pieces means to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I think great poetry, as it were, evokes in the hearer the spirit of what they're talking about. Let's just say there's a fragrance in poetry that immediately conjures up paradise, immediately conjures up all sorts of associations. And the way Father Vasilius spoke was like that. Often I'd ask him a question. I sort of ended up being the monastery artist. I had a lot of time with him discussing what he wanted me to do. So I'd ask a question, and his answer at first didn't seem to be an answer. And I realized that, and I don't think he did it consciously, I would perhaps ask a question that came from the brain. I wanted to sort of tidy everything up and have everything boxed in. But his answer came from the heart to the heart. So at first it didn't seem an answer at all, but I realized he was sort of getting in behind the question, and he would help me to see differently. And I think that's the great thing of true liturgical art, that it doesn't so much sort of teach things, do this and do that. It changes the way we see, and that changes the way that we act. And I think Father Vasilius was very important in that respect in my life. And now at Mount Athos and in England, I met 2 other people who since have been canonized as saints. I noticed in their own way they did the same thing. They were helping you to see differently, not just to sort of act differently. The acting differently came naturally from seeing differently.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating because it brings up the point of not just being told to do this or do that, as you're saying, but rather a paradigm shift of watching someone else live such a righteous or holy life and realizing, hey, this is the way I want to become. And I see this beauty. And it sounds like to me that really drew you in more to the iconography,
Mm,
seeing these wonderful lives being followed, really,
mm,
from saintly lives to the monastic lives that you saw,
mm,
and probably your own monastic life as well, I'm sure.
mm.
The beauty that you saw in that impacting your artistic endeavors.
Certainly.
I would definitely love to touch on the point of the literature meeting the iconography or artistic designs, because I completely agree with you in the fact of you can't have one without the other almost, because the two go so well together. Of course, you can have art that's not based on literature, literature not based on art, but literature is an art, and of course, art itself is what it is. And I feel that when you combine the two, it creates a deeper shift, you could say, in how we're able to view the world, as you're talking about.
Mm,
A great example of this, of course, would be Dostoevsky, who I like to say writes in images.
yeah.
He writes in imagery that really resonates with you, and as he's my favorite writer, I find that I'm able to remember what Dostoevsky said in a novel far longer than I am any other novelist or writer because of that imagery that you're talking about. It's something that stays with you, that you internalize. I think that's how iconography is as well, that you're talking about. It kind of goes in from the back
Yeah.
rather than being forceful and coming in through the front, which a lot of art, of course, in the modern sense, attempts to do.
I do think that,
So,
that art worthy of the name, be it written or painted or sculpted, it's always got to have an abstract element to it, and abstract in the
mhm.
original sense of the term. That means to draw out something that is there rather than just be unrealistic. It's actually more realistic than art that just looks at the surface. So with Dostoevsky, he tends to exaggerate things, but he exaggerates things that are true. Apparently, he used to score newspapers to find out weird things that people had done, perhaps crimes or something. But he would take these extreme acts as an abstraction, as it were, a revelation of some deeper psychological malaise or spiritual malaise. And that's what makes it so graphic. I mean, the way people talk. I mean, I've been to Russia 3 times, and I notice that they do things so intensely,
Yeah.
intensified, abstracted, concentrated. And I think likewise, true liturgical art is realistic, but not naturalistic. In other words, it will
Mm.
bring out the fire, like Moses saw the burning bush. Realistic art, that's distinct from naturalistic, indicates the fire of something. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that leads us into part of our next conversation, which is iconography in the Western world, which is obviously a lot of what you have focused on with your restoration work, and what we talked about when we first met in St. Andrews is the current project that you finished of the chapel. If you'd like to touch on that a bit.
Thank you. Yes. This castle is owned by a man who's half Greek, half Scottish, and his father, who was really particularly devout, had wall painted a large room in the castle to use as a chapel, and as a church services would be held there for the public as well as for himself. But dry rot set in one place, so they had to cut out a lot of the wall paintings. So I was commissioned to repaint them. But it's unusual in that I've got to restore something that is there. Normally, I had to start from scratch.
Hmm.
So a lot of the churches that have been asked to paint are old and have already got an established tradition of iconography from the early church. For example,
Hmm.
my parish church, the foundation is actually 8th century. The existing church is later, about 12th century. But there are frescoes there of the martyrdom of Thomas Becket from about 1380. So they exist, but there are areas of fresh plaster from the restoration of the church, which I was allowed to fresco on. So there in the east wall, I drew on the Romanesque tradition, which is iconography, really, to my mind, the highest point that Western iconography reached. So without copying it, it was inspired by that. So yeah, I think we tend to think of iconography as an Eastern exotic Byzantine thing, but that's only because we've experienced so much iconoclasm in the West. I mean, in
Hmm.
Britain in particular with Henry VIII and Cromwell more than Henry VIII. To some extent, I think after Vatican II, Catholics have experienced a form of iconoclasm, though I think there's been a restoration of the belief in beauty now, something that I think you're trying to promote. So, so yeah, no, it's an exciting time to be an iconographer. But just jotted down a few notes here in preparation for this, and I think this raises this whole thing of tradition. And I think this is what fascinates
Definitely.
me, that different periods of human life, they've been heresies, as it were, heresies in the sense of a distortion of truth. In the Christian church, the heresies have been normally about the Holy Trinity and the nature of Christ. But I think the main heresy now is actually considering the human person. What is the human person? So here, instead of humans being fulfilled in relationship, you fulfill by being yourself in opposition to others. So other people become a threat to my individuality. So therefore, tradition, which links me to other people, not only living, but people from the past, is a threat to my individuality. Whereas a personalist, a Trinitarian approach to human nature, relative relationship, I become myself in relation to Collin. I listen, God gave me a face, which means person, interestingly, both in Greek and in Latin. Face and person is the same word. So I was to hear Collin, I was to see him, to learn from you. So I expand into your space. Through your wisdom, I expand. Whereas if I see you as a threat to me, I'm an individual, an isolated individual, then I'm just going to shrink. So I think that's something which has got to be looked at. What is the human person? And for Dostoevsky, it was freedom, ultimately. All his books are about freedom, the use or abuse of it. And the reason why that's so important, I believe, is that a person is fulfilled with love, and you can't have love unless you have freedom. And I think this is why people are profoundly affected by churches that are completely filled with frescoes or wall paintings. I was talking about this yesterday to someone, and they found that going into a church where you're completely surrounded by saints and angels, you're immediately in a city, you're immediately in community. If it's just an individual icon of a saint, it's me and that person, and if I walk away, as it were, they're no longer there. But in a church, you're completely surrounded, and no matter what you do, they're always there. That community is always there. So I can choose to participate in that community and become not only the image of God, but become the likeness of God, the Holy Trinity. Or I can just leave and shrivel up into an isolated individual. So we talk about big
Yeah.
stuff here, I think. And I think, I think that's probably the main lesson that our secular West has got to learn, to repent of
Yeah.
individualism and become person again.
Yeah, especially when you go into an Orthodox church and you see all the iconography where it's in every single corner of the church, just like my parish back home in the US. It's covered from head to toe, you could say, in iconography. And that's something that even when you're sitting there, like you're saying, by yourself, it doesn't have the same feeling that a Gothic cathedral has in France or Germany or anywhere else that you find in Europe. And while that's not inherently a bad thing, the difference that you would feel in Gothic church, there's a certain level of comfort that you find in iconography, I would say. Like you're talking about not being alone. Because as an Orthodox Christian, seeing those icons, thinking about the people who are surrounding us, the saints, when you see those images, as you talked about earlier, it's not supposed to be realistic, it's not supposed to be naturalistic, but rather it's supposed to be a reminder. Something that reminds you that these saints are surrounding you, that this is a holy space, and that really, like you said, you're not alone. I think that's the biggest thing is that individuality. People who go into a very large, solitary Western cathedral that's non-Orthodox, often they describe feeling very small, very alienated almost, you could say. And while that's not always, of course, the case, there's absolutely beautiful Western cathedrals, many of which I've been to, thankfully. It is much more so that you can find even a small Orthodox church that has a relatively small amount of iconography that feels, the word I would use almost is cozy. It feels like home. It feels like you're surrounded by friends, which are the saints, of course, the saints to ask intercessions from. But that to touch on that individuality is when the Western world began to focus so much on becoming an individual, differentiating ourselves from other people, it's almost like you can think of it as atoms in a chain, where when you take a single atom off, it doesn't have much use. But when you have all those atoms together, it creates the world we see around us. And I feel like that's what produced Western culture and the Western world that we're trying so hard to get back to, and that both of us love so much, is when we had all of these people working together to create beauty, to create society, civilization, and really just good living, a good lifestyle that was based on Christian principles and beauty. And of course, the foundation of that being truth, which is Jesus Christ. So I think that individuality is something that definitely poses a challenge or a roadblock to what we want for the future, because the community that is found in the Orthodox Church, or many Roman Catholics or traditional Anglicans find this as well, is that foundational beauty that allows them to live their life, which is something that is so vital that iconographers like yourself are able to reflect and are able to paint and create for people. So that kind of leads into one of the things I mentioned to you in my email was the future of iconography in the West. Where do you think we're going in the future? Do you think we're going to see more iconography, more churches being built? Or do you think that the secular world will continue to eat away at what we have?
Well, if I profit, I could tell you, but I can just reflect on trends I've seen, I suppose.
Sure.
Certainly young people, I noticed, are coming back to Christianity, often from completely secular backgrounds. So I think I suppose the secular West is getting so bizarre with its wokeness, particularly, almost defining, in the name of unity, defining people by whatever it is, male or female, or gay or not gay. And so instead of being in God's image and being persons and then having a role, male or female, whatever it is, we're sort of atomizing in this way. So I think some people are just getting fed up with this and they want to get to the core of things. What is there that unites us? So I think that's led some people to come back to Christ from a completely non-Christian background. So that's exciting. A lot of my commissions are from Anglican and Catholic churches as well as from Orthodox. So I think there's a desire there to return to faces, basically. It's interesting that in Britain, when Cromwell sort of had all the images wrecked, replaced it with the Ten Commandments. So you go into these churches, you've got a panel there for the Ten Commandments. So if you reject the face, you just get a law, you get a legal system. Now, there are laws, Christ has given us commandments, but these commandments are an expression of his love, an expression of the nature of the human person. But like a scientific law isn't something written down so the apple thinks, oh, gravity, so I've got to fall now. The laws are actually an expression of the ontological reality of things. But with the loss of faces, as it were, through iconoclasm in Britain, the legal system of salvation became predominant. Christ suffered on our behalf, as it were, so the Father's justice could be satisfied by his death and so on. Everything's sort of far too legal. So I think people are getting fed up with that. So I think there's a general move in the healthier parts of society towards beauty, not in the sentimental sense, but beauty as an experience of truth. I asked a lot of these people in our church what first led them to become Christians, and virtually all of them had encountered beauty in one form or the other, and that's what started the journey for them. One had heard some Bajant on a Russian chant. He thought, wow, that's come from a different place, So that led him to read and to inquire. Another guy went to our evening service in our little church where we don't have electricity, just oil lamps and icons, and that just really freaked him out in a good way. Completely opened a new way of seeing. And then he sort of, as it were, into the Word. He started to ask and read. So I think there's hope. I think Christians have got to be a lot more intelligent than we have been, and not so defensive. I think often we're on the defense, trying to think, well, science is ahead of us, so we've got to sort of try to excuse our existence. I think if we think deeply, and some good books have been written about this recently, we realize that actually a Christian worldview actually underpins the basis of science. If you don't believe in God, you don't believe in order, and therefore there's no actual metaphysical basis for science. So I think we need to look at that again and not be so defensive about that, and feeling as though we're under attack. We're under attack from scientism, but not science. That's a big difference. And you're talking individual. There's individualism, and there's individual. If we understand individual as the uniqueness, coming back to God actually purifies our uniqueness and manifests it more clearly. So I think we've got to distinguish between individualism, which is sort of the modern heresy, and true personhood, which actually repentance basically makes you more yourself, to put it bluntly. So I'm an optimist by nature, and I think some really good things are happening. And it's ultimately free choice whether or not people take that bait, as it were, whether or not people follow the fragrance and find the source of the fragrance is up to them. But what concerns me is that I think it's the church that's failed the West, I think. We've got a secular world now because Christians failed to live the true Christian life. So when we find Christians truly living it, living a beautiful life, things will change. So the onus is on us. It's quite easy to grumble about the secular West, but we're at fault, basically. The so-called prosperity gospel in America, I mean, that's to blame for a lot. The misunderstanding of Genesis, suggesting that the world's a big bank of money we can just take out, plunder it as much as we want, and this is to glorify God. Well, that's sort of rubbish. So basically, Christian heresy about the world has led to an ecological crisis. Our consumerism is a sort of a perverted form of priesthood. The sort of offering creation, transforming it in a good way and offering it, changing wheat and grapes into bread and wine, and then offering it. We just sort of take wheat and wine, we make things and get drunk on it instead of offering it to God. So, I think there are signs in the more intelligent thinking, questioning, self-aware Christian areas that things are returning to the roots.
Yeah, I think when you were talking, I had this idea of, as you were saying, when the iconography was removed in Western churches or artistic paintings were removed, you see the Ten Commandments being put in that place and it becomes more legalistic. It almost has the opposite effect of what those reformers were trying to do, or what I would like to believe, intended to do, is to focus more on, let's say, the spirituality aspect when they felt that these images were idolatrous, which of course they're not, but they felt that they were, and they were trying to, their intent was to return it to more of a spiritually minded Christianity. But I think what comes about from that, and not even what I think, but what I see, is people became so materialistic because they did not have that beauty to look up to. And it's not even that beauty comes just from the imagery. It's what the imagery reminds us of. Because when you see an icon, of course, it's absolutely beautiful, but there's levels of beauty, we could say, in an aesthetic sense of there's Byzantine iconography, which is absolutely beautiful, but then of course there's like Baroque paintings, Baroque churches, which are overwhelming for the senses and are incredibly beautiful as well for different people. But those evoke different emotions and different feelings within us. And that iconography for so long has evoked exactly the right amount of emotion in people, because we see what, let's say, Baroque art brought within Roman Catholicism, and we see what iconography has brought within Orthodoxy or within Eastern Catholicism. And that turns into theology, that turns into practice of how people live their lives. And of course, that goes downstream to the rest of the culture, as you're talking about, where we see so much materialism and secularism in the West today. And that comes about from not having lofty beauty to look up to, divine beauty to aspire to. We simply have these base, more pleasurable things. Like you said, we get drunk on the creations that we make when we don't have something to aspire to. And that kind of is the concept that's so popular right now among traditionalist circles, is the endless march of progress that people like to say since the Industrial Revolution, which as traditionalists we would of course say is ridiculous, because this quote unquote progress that people say we've made is has been at the expense of the soul in the Western world, I would say. A friend of mine often says that in the East, the body is what suffers, often from poverty. But in the West, the soul is what suffers, because that is, it's been contained by so much materialism, constant advertising, pleasure, whatever it may be. all those things have suffocated it, if you will. But when we have that beauty, we're so fortunate to have people like you that are able to create and reflect divine beauty. That's something to aspire to and to allow us to live a better life, I feel like. And so just kind of moving to the next part of our conversation is, where do you see the future of iconography going in the West? Do you see there being a restoration of more of the old style of what you would see in these churches that you restore? Or do you think that there's going to be more development within the artistic side of things within the West relating to religion?
Yeah, I hope that there'll be a development, so there's something which could only have happened in the 21st century. And there are some shining iconography examples in this already. Father Gregor Krug is a great example of that. He could only paint what he painted in the 20th century. Fully traditional, but it's unique. Someone like that, though, you can't sort of copy. You can be inspired by spirit, but I think it'd be false to sort of copy his style. But he's an inspiration, I think, for what can be done. And then there's some individual iconographers who are doing it well. There's Ivan Polverari in Italy. He's Roman Catholic, that doesn't so gifted and so free, yet so humble, and you feel that what he's doing is within the tradition. But it's a first language rather than a second. I think a lot of us, I include myself, sort of have iconography as a second learned language. And gradually it's becoming more natural to me. But I think that's what we're looking for. And it could take a few generations yet. I think mature, not development, but let's call it mature development, happens for iterations. You get your geniuses, sort of stellar people like Theophane the Greek was, but normally it just happens by iteration. So that would be doubtless influenced by great Western iconography, Romanesque, Anglo-Saxon, Carolingian, etc. But we don't want to just be doing pastiches, traditionalists, and just resurrecting the past. It's drawing on the wisdom of the past, but responding to our particular needs. So just to my right here is a massive icon that was commissioned called the Transfiguration of Creation. You can see it on my website. That was commissioned by a professor of marine biology and evolution and ecology in San Diego. And this is a new icon, completely new. So there I try to combine elements of Maximus the Confessor's teaching. I was drawing on some icons, particularly one called All Creation Rejoices in You. So there I was trying to draw on the icon tradition, but also responding to a contemporary challenge. So I think it's exciting times, and there are wonderful websites like the Orthodox Arts Journal, where you get some really wonderful, intelligent, perceptive articles in the whole range of liturgical arts. Your own podcast and Jonathan Bajot and others, Martin Shaw, just so many really exciting people who are fully in the tradition, but can sort of look at things with a fresh eye. I think what Martin has often said he's trying to do is to rehydrate Christianity. We often use words but without really knowing what we're talking about. So we really got to find fresh words, fresh images. I think that's sort of how Christ taught, and he used often mundane things, business images in his parables to express spiritual things. So people thought, wow, he talks with authority. He's not just sort of aping what the scribes have said. He obviously knows what he's talking about, and he's saying it in a fresh way. St. Paisius, saint, I knew him at Athos a bit. People just loved the images that he came up with, fresh ways of saying ancient things, which made you listen.
Yeah. And people just love parables, of course, as you were saying, Christ. Like the parables that stay with people throughout 2,000 years, even people who are not Christians, they know these parables, they know biblical stories, and these are cultural motifs that run so deep, even amongst the secular culture today, that still underpin what we have. People often forget that even though we're an increasingly wild world in the West today, that our legal system in the United States and Great Britain still has a Christian foundation at its core, recognizing human dignity, human rights, and the value of family still. We're very fortunate to be in the Western world, and to be able to even take up this cause, take up this fight of tradition, of traditionalism, and to be able to revitalize what is so great from the past and bring it into the future. And that kind of brings me to this question, which is, what do you think through your time of living in the monastic life in the West, but in Great Britain, of course, but also working with Western iconography or just Western culture in general, what do you think really makes us Western? I know, of course, that's a very loaded question, but I'm sure you have some thoughts on what really makes us different than those from other parts of the world.
Yes, I was thinking about this question. My first response was we've got to be really, really careful in differentiating too much. St. Maximus the Confessor said the root of sin is to divide human nature. So if I understand, and there is only one human nature, if I understand that, if you, Collin, Cooper, are suffering, then your suffering is mine, literally. I don't have to sort of pretend I am. We're all, as it were, in the same ocean, so that if it's polluted there, then that pollution reaches me, or something good happens in that country. The water I experience is affected by that. So I'm always rather wary of defining too much, and whether it's be male or female or New Zealand or English person. Now, there are general patterns, I suppose. So with that caveat, that I think what's most important to me is the people in God's image. I don't care what colour or how many legs they've got, whatever, they're in God's image. But I suppose, in generality, Western culture has tended to like order. I lived in Greece for 3 years, studying modern Greek for a year at Thessaloniki, and then a total of 2 years at Mount Athos, and also visited Russia quite a bit. They don't mind chaos so much there, but a sort of organic order comes out of that chaos. My Greek friends often laugh at me. I'd always like to know what time they're going to arrive and order things, and that's a good thing. They made fun of me for it, but things worked. They had their own inner logic, like with contracts, business contracts. So two businessmen would talk and have coffee and that, and then the last 2 minutes, they would make the business agreement. It was based on relationship rather than on anything written down. So I think we like order. It's interesting, St. Benedict, he tried to live like an Egyptian monk initially. Really hard ascetic life. And he goes, actually, it's not going to work. It doesn't work for me, and it's probably not going to work for any monks who join me. And his rule of life shows great wisdom. He says, well, monks shouldn't really have wine, but we seem to need it here in Gaul, so we limit the amount. And sort of really long vigils. There was sort of prayer was broken up throughout the day. So he's an epitome to me of taking the best of in this case, Eastern Christianity, Egyptian Christianity, and the strength, or even the weaknesses of the West, and making them a strength. Yeah, I mean, you could say the Orthodox Church is a bit chaotic in terms of its different jurisdictions and all that. At least Roman Catholicism has some sort of order, so we could learn a lot from that. We can say science has really flourished in the Western mind. So I think in all these things, in our own personalities, we normally naturally be good at one thing. Then to strengthen that, we need to balance it with the other. So some people are naturally intuitive, then they need to introduce a bit of order to direct their intuition aright. Some like too much order and they get a bit too tight, they need to loosen up a bit. So I think monasticism is going to be really important for the West, because monasticism has order, but you're aiming high, you're aiming for invisible things, you're aiming for inner prayer, and that can ameliorate some of the sort of fascination with outer order and with a rather juridical way of understanding truth. And I think this is very healthy, that beauty is becoming a more important element of wealth. I'm just trying to read Timothy Petitsis' enormous book. I'm sort of dipping into it rather than reading it, called The Ethics of Beauty. And he said there that beauty comes before truth, which is a radical thing to say. And I've been thinking about it, and I think it's because beauty is an experience of truth. I could write about truth, but until it's experienced, it's not incarnate. So I think there's hope there for the West. Good architecture. I know King Charles, and he's pushed for a long time for beauty to return to architecture, not just sort of aping Georgian architecture, whatever, but a hospital, an institution, it's got to have a beauty to it, because beauty heals, beauty inspires. Ugliness is incredibly oppressive, and I think our Bill of Human Rights ought to, not going to be happy with the term rights, but if we were to rewrite it, we ought to say something like there is a right to beauty, because beauty is what makes us wealthy. Wealth isn't just accumulation of things; they can actually sink us and drown us. So I think a lot of the West's future is dependent on how it responds to true beauty, really. And it could bring all this sort of knowledge that it has. Like a lot of my iconography, I've learned from scientific papers where they've analysed great works of art and understood the different layers and all these mysteries that have been forgotten because the tradition of apprenticeship has been broken. So now modern science can help us revive these mysteries. So here, that's a wonderful example of the Western sort of scientific mind actually helping the spiritual journey.
Yeah, I think that's very profound in the sense of, as we're talking about Dostoevsky, who says beauty is what saves, or beauty will save the world, depending on translation. And that's something that's always really stuck with me, is living a beautiful life in every single aspect. Because of course, those who are traditional Christians, they go as much as possible to church on Sunday or following the liturgical calendar. And of course, that's, let's say, their daily dose of beauty. They may go about the rest of their day wherever they may be, and it may be more mundane concrete buildings, more brutalist architecture depending on where they live. But that beauty that they get in church is so profound that it stays with them for the rest of the time until they go back to church again. And that's something that draws people into Christianity, of course. But also, as you're talking about public buildings, architecture in the Western world is something that I think is a very good point, that that's something that defines the West, is the architecture that we have created. Especially in Great Britain, we see such wonderful architecture that's been preserved in many places, whether it be country estates, universities, individual houses that people have kept over time, or public buildings, of course. Great Britain is a wonderful country filled with so much beauty, and we see so much of that conserved, as both you and I well know, having traveled around. But I think that's something that can be improved on in other parts of the Western world, specifically the US. Because in the US, we see a lot of materialism, even more so than you would see in Great Britain or other places in Western Europe. Obviously, there's much more of a consumeristic culture that we see in America, even in relation to these other places. But beauty inspires people, in my opinion, to consume less. It inspires people to value what they have. Because if they want to buy something beautiful, whether it be a piece of clothing that's more, how would I say, high quality, that was more crafted by an artisan, let's say, or is just a better quality fabric that costs more, they're going to care more about that item. They're going to care more about taking care of it. And then we're not going to have such an impact on the environment as we see with people throwing away so many clothes. Same goes for furniture, or books even, of course. Both of us have many books behind us, and old books are something that are wonderful because it's something you can hold on to, instead of nowadays people just continually flip through, their Kindle or whatever it may be. But these physical actualizations of beauty that we can hold on to, that we can see, that we can value, whether it be a piece of art, whether it be a book, whether it be materials in our life that are just more aesthetically pleasing, whatever it may be. It could be as simple as a desk, instead of it being what I would call like a medical white desk, that you get from IKEA. It's perhaps it's something that was salvaged, from like the 1940s, 1950s, that is a darker brown wood that just is more aesthetically pleasing. And when people go about their life and they see even those small details, I think that gives them more of a will to see more and more beauty. Because if they are in a room such as at the University of St. Andrews here, where there's so many beautiful rooms in the buildings, and then you compare that to the rest of the world, you're like, I want to go back there. I want more beauty. It's a palpable feeling, as you well know. And when you have that, inspires you to go deeper and deeper into that beauty, I think, if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, the number of words for beauty in Greek, one of them is kalos, which means good and beautiful. And it seems to be related etymologically to kalin, which means to call. So beauty calls us. And I was thinking about the other day, what makes something beautiful in the deepest sense, rather than just being a mask of beauty. And I think it's beautiful to the extent that it makes us beautiful or enables us to become beautiful. So sometimes iconography and Gothic art uses ugliness for beautiful ends, like icons of John the Baptist. Yeah, he's got skinny arms and hair sticking out like nails, and he's got disheveled hair. It has a noble face normally, but even then the wrinkles you wouldn't call them particularly attractive. But if it's painted well, there's an ability in his features, and you realise his hard life, externally unattractive hard life, is there to produce beauty of spirit. So to me, beauty isn't defined by the sort of the warm, gooey feelings it gives temporarily, sort of titillating us.
Sure.
It actually challenges us and leaves us free to make a decision. Dostoevsky, when you read his books, you don't just do it as entertainment. You're left with a choice. Okay, who am I going to be like in this story? How am I going to see life? How am I going to act when I meet people in the next minute or two? So I think, beauty has the element of calling us to something beyond itself. So there's a humility to true beauty. It doesn't say, look at me. It says, any beauty in me is actually a theophanic revelation of beauty himself, capital B. To make beautiful things is hard work. It's very easy to make ugly things. It's very easy to make things that shock you. Most films nowadays just rather cheaply use violence to sort of shock you. And this is an entertainment of that. But we like to be sort of woken up. So you can be woken up by being slapped on the face, or you can be woken up by being presented with something astoundingly beautiful that opens up vistas to you and alerts you to something more than you've been aware of. So making beauty is hard. It's an asceticism. Beauty, another word for beauty in Greek is aureos, which is related to time. So if a blossom opens too early, it'll be killed by the frost. If it opens at the right time, at the beautiful time, it will grow into a fruit. So beauty isn't just a static thing. Beauty is always liturgical. It's one thing that Jane Jacobs, an American philosopher, as it were, particularly of architecture, said that cities are liturgical. And she was an atheist. She was saying that, well, she didn't say, but Timothy Petitsa's realized that what she was talking about was liturgy. And what's interesting about liturgy, a liturgical life, that movement through time is united with things, objects. We think of objects as still in time, frozen. But beauty is always movement combined with objects. And this is what's interesting about quantum mechanics and modern science. We realize that sort of atoms do and don't exist. Atoms are all to do with the relationship of things. That's why mathematics is so important. The mathematical formula describes a movement. It's like a musical score. Music is movement. And a musical score sort of, as it were, freezes it on paper. A mathematical formula is that. But the essence of it is movement. You're describing relationship, and relationship is always to do with movement. My voice creates movement in the air and conveys movement to you, and then you register it as something with meaning, hopefully.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess a good way to wrap this up would be what you personally want to see in the future for, let's say, your work, or the main thing that you think would be a good contribution in the future to Western society. And I guess to articulate that a bit better would be, if you could change one thing, we always ask people on the podcast, I guess, what would it be? Whether it be small, whether it be big, what is something that you, Aidan Hart, what was something that you want to see an impact on in a traditionalist sense?
Great question, Collin. I think it's to help people see people and God's creation differently, see it as a burning bush, I think. I think we act as we see. So if there's wrong action, it's because you've seen correctly. If there's right action, it's because you've seen correctly. So I suppose more and more I've seen that everything that drives me is just to, well, for someone of myself to see things better. Instead of just seeing you, Collin, you see another human being filling up space. I see you, as an awesome creature. There's only one Collin and ever will be, that you're a revelation of God. So the more I see you like that, the more I'll draw out of you, because I'm thirsty to meet Christ in you. So hopefully you'll change by me noticing things about you even you hadn't noticed. And likewise, stones. I mean, I carve stone, and before I started carving a stone, I carved wood, and wood is a living thing. Well, was living. I thought, stone, it's going to be a dead thing. It's not going to be so interesting to carve. But I realised that stone is incredible. It's a whole universe in stone. So it's helping me to see in even inanimate things as a burning bush, that God created stone, but his word remains in that stone and speaks to me. So I think that's what I like to do, for people to sort of see creation as a dowry, as a wedding gift, as an engagement ring. My icon creation, you can see it on my website, culminates in the New Jerusalem, culminates in Christ and the bridegroom. So that's what I like to leave behind.
That is a fantastic answer, and it perfectly culminates, I feel like, your life and your life's work. And I'll definitely, the link to all of your social media and your website will definitely be in the bio for anyone who wants to check out Aidan's work more, see his iconography, or just any other content that he's put out. And yeah, I thank you, Aidan, for coming on to the podcast. It was great talking with you as always. And I look forward to hopefully talking to you again in the future.
That'd be a pleasure, Collin. It's been lovely talking with you. And so thank you for your insightful questions.
Thank you, Aidan.